The wind that came down from the Colorado mountains in the autumn of 1885 carried something colder than snow. It carried the kind of silence that settles over a woman when she finally understands that the man she loved is never coming back. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, though most folks in the little mining town of Cold Creek just called her Ellie. She was 22 years old, with hair the color of wheat in late September, and eyes that had once been full of laughter. By the time the first frost touched the valley that year, those eyes had gone quiet, and the laughter had folded itself away somewhere deep inside her chest, where she would keep it locked for a very long time. The man she had loved was named Jonas Reed. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a slow way of speaking and a slower way of smiling. And when he had ridden into Cold Creek 2 years earlier looking for work on the cattle drives, Ellie had been the first person to offer him a cup of coffee at her father's small roadside inn. She had not meant to fall in love with him. She had not meant for any of it. But love, as the old women in town like to say, does not ask permission. It simply arrives, the way weather arrives, and you either learn to live in it or you drown. For nearly 2 years, Jonas had courted her in the quiet ways of frontier men. He brought her wildflowers in the spring, the small blue ones that grew up near the creek beds. He fixed the broken hinge on her father's barn door without being asked. He sat with her on the porch in the evenings and spoke of the ranch he would one day own, somewhere west, somewhere with good grass and clean water, and a sky big enough to forget your troubles in. And Ellie, who had never once in her life imagined leaving Cold Creek, began to imagine it. She began to imagine a whole life with this man, a house with a stone chimney, children running barefoot through the long grass, a porch where the two of them would grow old together, watching the sun set behind the mountains. She told him she was carrying his child on a Tuesday evening in early October. She remembered it was a Tuesday because her father had been butchering hogs that day, and the air had smelled of smoke and salt. She had waited until the supper dishes were cleared and the lamps were low, and then she had taken Jonas's hand and pressed it gently to her belly. Her voice trembled only a little when she spoke. "There's going to be a child, Jonas. Yours and mine. Come spring." He did not answer her at first. He looked at her hand, and then at her face, and then down at the floorboards, and the silence between them stretched out so long that she could hear the clock ticking in the next room. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and far away, as though it were coming from somewhere on the other side of a closed door. "I need to think, Ellie. I need a few days. Just give me that." He kissed her forehead before he left that night, and that kiss, she would later realize, was the last honest thing he ever gave her. Because Jonas Reed did not ride to the high pasture to think. Jonas Reed packed his saddlebags in the gray hour before dawn, took the horse he had bought with the money he had saved working for her father, and rode south out of Cold Creek without leaving so much as a note. By the time the sun came up over the ridgeline, he was gone, and Ellie, standing barefoot on the porch in her nightdress with the cold biting at her ankles, understood without being told that he had taken her future with him. She did not cry that morning. That was the thing the women in town would remark on later when the story made its way through the kitchens and the church pews. Ellie Hayes did not cry. She simply went back inside, put on her work dress, tied her apron, and started the morning bread. Her father, a quiet widower named Thomas Hayes, watched her from the doorway of the kitchen for a long time before he finally spoke. "He's not coming back, is he, girl?" She did not turn around. She only kept kneading the dough, her knuckles white against the pale flour, and after a long moment she answered him without looking up. "No, Pa, he isn't." And that was all that was ever said about it, between the two of them, for the rest of Thomas Hayes's life. The winter that followed was the hardest of her life. The town, of course, found out. Towns always find out. Some of the women were kind, in the careful way that frontier women had of being kind, bringing over jars of preserves and bundles of soft cloth without asking any questions. Others were not kind at all. There were whispers in the general store, sidelong glances at Sunday service, and one afternoon a deacon's wife stopped Ellie on the wooden sidewalk outside the post office and told her, in a voice loud enough for 3 other women to hear, that she ought to be ashamed to show herself in a house of God. Ellie listened without flinching. Then she walked into the church and sat in her usual pew and stayed there until the service ended, her hands folded over her swelling belly, her chin lifted in a way that dared anyone to say another word. The baby came in the deep cold of February, in the small upstairs bedroom of her father's inn, with a midwife named Hannah Boyd kneeling at the foot of the bed and a kerosene lamp burning low against the frost on the windows. The labor was long and brutal, and there was a moment near dawn when Hannah quietly told Thomas Hayes to go downstairs and pray, because she did not know if either of them would live through the morning. But Ellie did live, and so did the boy. He came into the world red-faced and squalling, with a full head of dark hair and a cry so strong it rattled the window panes. And when Hannah placed him in his mother's arms, Ellie looked down at him and felt something inside her break open and bloom at the same time. She named him Samuel, after her grandfather. She did not give him his father's name. She would not even speak his father's name, not once in all the years that followed. Samuel grew the way children grow in hard country, which is to say quickly and without complaint. By the time he was 3, he was hauling kindling for the stove. By the time he was 5, he was helping his grandfather with the chickens and learning to ride the old gray mare. He was a serious child, watchful in a way that made grown men uneasy. But when he laughed, which was not often, his whole face changed, and you could see his mother in him, the woman she had been before, the one with the wheat-colored hair and the eyes full of light. Ellie loved him with a fierceness that frightened her sometimes. She loved him the way drowning people love air. He was the only good thing that man had ever given her, and she was determined that he would never know want, and never know shame, and never, ever know the name of the father who had ridden away. But children, of course, ask questions. They cannot help it. The world is a puzzle to them, and they must fit the pieces together, and the missing pieces are the ones they wonder about most. Samuel began asking about his father when he was 4 years old, sitting on the porch one summer evening with his small, bare feet swinging above the floorboards. Ellie had been mending a shirt by the last of the daylight when he turned to her and asked, very softly, the question she had been dreading for years. "Mama, where's my pa?" She set the shirt down in her lap. She looked out across the yard at the long blue shadows of the cottonwoods. And then she lied to her son, because the truth was a wound she could not yet bear to open in him. "Your pa was a good man, Samuel. He died before you were born. He loved horses and the high country, and he was brave and kind. He watches over us now, from wherever good souls go." Samuel thought about this for a long moment, the way he thought about everything, with that serious little furrow between his brows. Then he nodded slowly, accepting it, and leaned his head against her arm. And the two of them watched the sun go down without saying another word. She told the lie so steadily and so often that for a long time she almost believed it herself. The years went by the way years go by in small towns. Ellie's father grew old and then frail, and then, in the autumn of Samuel's 8th year, quietly died in his sleep with a Bible open on his chest. Ellie buried him beside her mother in the little cemetery behind the church, and afterward she sold the inn, because she could not bear to run it alone, and she used the money to buy a small homestead 2 miles outside of town. It was not much, a 4-room cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a creek that ran clean and cold most of the year. But it was hers, and she made it a home. She raised chickens and kept a milk cow and took in mending from the women in town. And she and Samuel lived a life that was quiet and modest and almost happy. Almost. Because there was always, in the back of Ellie's mind, the question of him, of Jonas, where he had gone, what he had become. Whether he ever thought of her, on long nights when the wind was high and the stars were close. She told herself she did not care. She told herself she had buried him long ago, the way she had buried her father, the way she had buried the girl she had once been. But the truth is that you cannot bury a man who is still alive somewhere, drawing breath, walking the earth. You can only build a house over the grave and try not to listen for the sound of him underneath. Samuel, meanwhile, was growing into a boy who looked more like his father every year. Ellie saw it in the set of his shoulders, in the slow way he smiled, in the way he tilted his head when he was thinking. It was a quiet kind of torture, watching him grow into a ghost. But she never said a word. She kissed his forehead each night and told him she loved him, and she watched him sleep, and she promised herself over and over that the past would stay buried. And then, in the spring of Samuel's 11th year, the past came knocking. It came in the form of a traveling cattle buyer named Wilbur Sloan, who stopped at the Cold Creek General Store on his way back from a long ride through the Southern Territories. He was an old friend of the storekeeper, and the two of them stood out on the porch in the warm afternoon sun, drinking lemonade and trading the kind of news that men trade when they have not seen each other in a year. Ellie was inside the store buying flour and sugar, and Samuel was waiting for her on the steps, and that was how the boy came to overhear what he was never meant to hear. The cattle buyer was talking about a big cattle operation down near the New Mexico border, near a town called Sandstone, run by a man who had come up from nothing and built himself an empire of grass and steers. A hard man, the cattle buyer said, a rich man, a man named Jonas Reed. Samuel did not move when he heard the name. He sat very still on the wooden step, with his hands folded in his lap, and he listened. The cattle buyer said that Jonas Reed had no wife and no children, that he lived alone in a big white house on a hill, that he was respected and feared in equal measure, and that he had once mentioned, after too much whiskey, that he had come up out of Colorado a long time ago. Samuel listened to every word, and he understood, in the quick, certain way that children sometimes understand things, that this was a name he had heard before, not from his mother, from the whispers of other children, from the half-overheard conversations of grown-ups at church socials when they did not know he was listening. Jonas Reed, the name his mother would never say. That night, Samuel did not sleep. He lay in his small bed in the loft of the cabin and stared up at the rough pine beams above his head, and he turned the name over and over in his mind like a stone in his hand. By morning, something inside him had hardened into a shape he did not yet have a word for. He did not tell his mother what he had heard. He went about his chores as he always did. He fed the chickens, he carried water from the creek, he weeded the kitchen garden. But in the quiet places where no one was watching, he began to plan. It took him nearly a year to do what he meant to do. He saved every coin he was given. He took on extra work in town, sweeping out the livery stable for the blacksmith, running errands for the postmistress, splitting kindling for the widows who lived on the edge of town. He told his mother the money was for a new saddle, and she believed him, because she had no reason not to. He studied the maps in the schoolhouse when the teacher was not looking. He learned that Sandstone was nearly 400 miles south, across the high desert, through country that men twice his age would not cross alone. And he did not care. He was 12 years old by then, tall for his age, lean and strong from a lifetime of hard work, and he had something burning in his chest that was older than he was. He took the revolver from the trunk at the foot of his grandfather's old bed on a Sunday morning in late April, while his mother was at church. It was an old Colt, single action, the grip worn smooth by his grandfather's hand, and there were 6 bullets in the small tin box beside it. He loaded the gun the way his grandfather had once shown him, and he wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth, and he put it in the bottom of his saddlebag beneath a change of clothes and a loaf of bread and a small tin of his mother's biscuits. He left a note on the kitchen table. It said only this: "Mama, I love you. I have to go and see something for myself. I will come back. Please do not be afraid. Samuel." Then he saddled the old gray mare, and he rode south out of Cold Creek in the soft gray light before dawn, and he did not look back. Ellie found the note when she came in from feeding the chickens. She read it once, and then again, and then a third time, and the bowl of eggs in her hand slipped and broke on the floor, and she did not even notice. She rode into town within the hour and asked everyone she could find if they had seen her boy. And a freight driver coming up from the South Fork told her he had passed a tall, thin child on a gray mare 20 miles down the road, riding hard, and that the child had not stopped to speak. Ellie tried to follow. She rode south for 3 days, asking at every farmhouse, every trading post, every dusty crossroads. But Samuel was riding faster than a mother's grief, and somewhere out in the great empty country south of Pueblo, she lost his trail entirely, and she had to turn back, sick with fear, praying to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. Samuel, meanwhile, was learning what the country could do to a boy who rode alone. He slept under the stars and woke with frost in his hair. He ran out of bread on the 4th day and ate wild onions and a rabbit he managed to shoot with the old Colt, though the shot took him 3 tries, and the noise frightened the mare so badly she nearly threw him. He crossed rivers that came up to the horse's belly. He passed through one small town where a kind woman fed him supper and asked him no questions, and another where a drunken man tried to steal his horse and got the sharp end of Samuel's boot heel for his trouble. He grew thinner. He grew quieter. The hard thing in his chest grew harder. And after 23 days on the road, on a hot, bright afternoon in the middle of May, he rode the gray mare up over a long, sage-covered ridge and looked down into a wide green valley. And he saw, on a low hill in the middle of that valley, a big white house with a red roof and a tall iron gate. And he knew without being told that he had found the place. He did not ride straight in. He waited until the sun was low. He tied the mare in a stand of cottonwoods half a mile from the gate, and he checked the old Colt, and he walked the rest of the way on foot, his small, dusty boots stirring up little puffs of red dust in the road. The iron gate was open. A ranch hand was leading a horse toward the barn and did not even glance at the boy. Samuel walked up the long, curving path to the front porch of the White House, and he climbed the 3 wide steps, and he knocked on the heavy oak door with a hand that did not shake. The man who opened the door was tall, broad through the shoulders, with iron gray at his temples, and a face weathered by 12 hard years of sun and wind. He looked down at the boy on his porch, at the dusty clothes and the burnt brown face and the strange dark eyes, and he started to ask the boy what business he had at the house of Jonas Reed. He did not get the chance, because Samuel had already drawn the old Colt from beneath his jacket, and he was pointing it with both hands at the broad chest of the man in the doorway. The man went very still. He did not raise his hands. He did not call out. He only looked at the boy, and then at the gun, and then back at the boy's face, and something moved behind his eyes that might have been recognition, though he could not yet name it. "Are you Jonas Reed?" The boy's voice was thin and dry from the road, but it did not waver. The man nodded once, slowly. "I am." "Did you know a woman named Eleanor Hayes? In Cold Creek, Colorado? 12 years ago?" The man did not answer right away. His face changed. The color went out of it, slowly, the way color goes out of the sky when a storm is coming. He looked at the boy's eyes, really looked at them, and he saw, with a terrible sudden clarity, what he should have seen the moment he opened the door. He saw his own face. He saw it as it had been 12 years ago, before the gray and the weather and the long nights of bad whiskey. He saw it looking back at him from the porch of his own house, pointing a gun at his heart. "Yes," he said, and his voice was almost a whisper. "I knew her. She was going to have a child, your child. Did you know that too?" "I knew." "And you left." "I left." Samuel's hands began to shake then, but he did not lower the gun. Tears were running down his face, cutting clean lines through the dust on his cheeks, but he did not seem to notice them. He was looking at the man in the doorway, and the man was looking back, and neither of them was speaking, and the only sound in the world was the wind moving through the cottonwoods down by the gate. "I came here to kill you." Jonas Reed did not answer for a long moment. Then he sank down, slowly, until he was kneeling on the porch in front of his son, and he was almost the same height as the boy, and he looked into the boy's eyes without flinching. "Then do it. If that's what you came for, I won't stop you. God knows I've earned it." Samuel stood there with the gun in his hands, with his finger on the trigger, with 12 years of fatherlessness burning in his chest, and he tried. He tried to do the thing he had come 400 miles to do, but he could not. Because the man on his knees was not the monster he had built in his mind on all those long, cold nights in the loft of the cabin. The man on his knees was just a man, a tired man, a guilty man, a man with gray at his temples and tears in his own eyes now, and Samuel understood, in a way that nearly broke him, that killing this man would not give him back the father he had never had. It would only make him into the kind of man his mother had spent 12 years protecting him from becoming. He lowered the gun. His arms dropped to his sides. He stood there on the porch of the big white house, and he began to cry the way only children can cry, with his whole body, with great shuddering breaths. And Jonas Reed reached out, slowly, the way a man reaches out to a wild thing, and he put his hand on his son's shoulder. The boy did not pull away. After a long moment, Jonas drew him in, and Samuel let himself be held, and the two of them knelt there on the porch in the long red light of the evening, while the wind moved through the cottonwoods and the world went on turning around them. Samuel stayed at the ranch for 3 days. He did not speak much. Jonas did not push him. He fed the boy and gave him a bed and showed him the horses, and on the 3rd morning he saddled his own horse and his son's gray mare, and the two of them rode north together, 400 miles, back to Cold Creek. Jonas did not ask if he would be welcome there. He knew he would not be. But he rode anyway, because there are some debts a man cannot pay from a distance, and some apologies that must be made standing in the doorway of the house you once ran away from. Ellie was on the porch when she saw them coming up the road. She had not slept in 26 days. Her hair had gone gray at the temples in those weeks, and there were hollows beneath her eyes that had not been there before. And when she saw the small figure of her son riding up the road on the old gray mare, she came down off the porch and ran to him, barefoot in the dust, and she pulled him down from the saddle and held him and did not let go for a very long time. She did not look at the man riding behind him. She did not need to. She had known who it was from the moment she saw the second horse on the ridgeline. She held her son, and she breathed in the dust and the sweat and the road on him, and she thanked the God she had stopped believing in. Jonas Reed dismounted quietly. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and he waited. He waited a long time. When Ellie finally looked at him over the top of her son's head, her face was not angry. It was something far worse than angry. It was tired. It was the face of a woman who had spent 12 years carrying something she should never have had to carry alone. He took a step forward, and he tried to speak, and at first the words would not come. "Ellie, I don't expect anything. I won't ask for anything. I only came to bring him home and to tell you, in front of him, that I was wrong. I was a coward. There isn't a day of these 12 years I haven't known it." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved across the yard. Somewhere in the barn, the milk cow shifted in her stall. And at last Ellie spoke, and her voice was quiet and steady, and it carried no forgiveness in it, but it carried no hatred either. "You can sleep in the barn tonight, Jonas. Tomorrow we'll talk. After that, we'll see." He nodded. He did not try to come closer. He led the horses to the barn and unsaddled them with the same slow, careful hands she remembered from a lifetime ago. And Ellie took her son inside and fed him supper and washed the road off him and held him while he slept. Jonas stayed for a long time in the end, though not in the way he might once have hoped. Ellie never married him. She never let him back into the house. But she let him become a part of Samuel's life, in the slow, careful way that broken things are mended, a little at a time, never quite the way they were before. Jonas bought a small parcel of land a mile down the road. He built himself a one-room cabin with his own hands. He came to supper on Sundays. He taught Samuel how to break a horse, how to read the weather, how to shoot a rifle the way a man ought to shoot a rifle, with respect and not with anger. He grew old in that cabin, alone, the way he had earned the right to grow old. And on the nights when the wind was high and the stars were close, he would sit out on his small porch and look up the road toward the lights of Ellie's cabin. And he would think about everything he had thrown away, and he would not weep because he had no right to. Ellie lived a long life. She never quite forgave him. But she came in the end to understand him, and that, she decided, was enough. She watched her son grow into a tall, quiet man with his father's shoulders and his mother's eyes. And she watched him marry a girl from the next valley over. And she held her first grandchild on a cold, bright morning in November. And she wept then, for the first time in 12 years. And the weeping was not bitter. Jonas was there too that morning, standing a little apart, his hat in his hands, the way he had stood in the yard the day he came back. Ellie looked at him over the head of her grandchild, and she did not smile, but she nodded, once, slowly, and he nodded back, and that was the closest thing to peace that the two of them would ever know. He died 4 winters later, in his small cabin down the road, alone, the way he had asked to die. Samuel found him in the morning. He had left a letter on the table, addressed to Ellie. She read it only once, and she never told anyone what it said, and she burned it in the stove that same evening. But that night she sat out on her porch for a long time, looking up at the cold, bright stars, and the wind came down from the mountains the way it had on that autumn night 12 and more years ago, and she let herself remember, just for a little while, the young man with the slow smile who had brought her wildflowers in the spring. Then she went inside, and she closed the door behind her, and she did not speak his name again. But she did not need to. Because somewhere in the next valley, a small boy with dark hair and serious eyes was learning to ride a horse the way his grandfather had taught his father, and his father had taught him. And the name of Jonas Reed lived on in the way that names live on out in that country. Not in stone, not in words, but in the slow, careful hands of the people who come after. In the way a man learns to gentle a horse instead of breaking it. In the way a father learns to stay instead of run. Samuel named that boy Thomas, after his grandfather. He did not name him Jonas. But on the morning his son was born, in the same small cabin where Samuel himself had grown up, he walked out to the porch in the cold dawn light and looked down the road toward the empty cabin where his father had once lived. And he stood there for a long time, holding the new weight of fatherhood in his chest. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, what it had cost his mother to raise him alone. He understood, too, what it had cost his father to come back. And he understood that both of those costs, the leaving and the returning, had been paid so that he could stand here, on this porch, in this cold, bright morning, with a son of his own asleep in the house behind him. He went back inside. He kissed his wife's forehead. He took the small bundle of his son into his arms and carried him to the window. And he showed him the long blue shadows of the cottonwoods and the slow gray ribbon of the creek and the high white peaks of the mountains beyond. And he whispered to the sleeping child a promise that he would keep for the rest of his life. He promised that he would not leave. He promised that whatever came, whatever the world asked of him, whatever fear or weakness or temptation tried to pull him away, he would stay. He would stay because his mother had stayed. He would stay because his father, in the end, had come back. He would stay because that was the only thing in all the long years of a man's life that truly mattered. Ellie lived to see that grandchild grow into a boy, and then into a young man, and she lived long enough to teach him to read by the light of the same kerosene lamp she had once used to mend shirts in the long winter evenings of her youth. She died on a soft afternoon in early autumn, with the windows open and the smell of wood smoke drifting in from the kitchen, and Samuel was holding her hand, and her last words were quiet and almost peaceful, and they were not about Jonas, and they were not about the long-ago hurt that had shaped her life. Her last words were about the wildflowers, the small blue ones that grew up near the creek beds. She told her son they would be blooming again in the spring, and that he must remember to walk down and look at them. And then she closed her eyes, and her breathing slowed, and after a little while it stopped, and she was gone. They buried her on the hill behind the cabin, beside her father, and beside the small, simple stone that Samuel had placed there 4 winters earlier for Jonas. The 3 of them lay together in the end, the woman who had been left, the man who had left her, and the father who had raised her when no one else would. And the wind came down from the mountains the way it always had, the way it always would, and it moved across the long grass on the hill, and it carried with it the small, clean smell of the creek and the cottonwoods and the high country beyond. And somewhere in the valley below, a child was laughing, and a horse was being gentled in a corral, and a woman was hanging wash on a line in the warm autumn sun, and life, which is the only answer the world ever gives to grief, went on. Samuel walked down to the creek that evening, as his mother had asked. It was too late in the year for the blue wildflowers. They had bloomed and gone months before. But he stood there anyway, at the bend in the creek where his mother had once stood as a young woman with a young man's hand in hers, and he watched the water move over the smooth stones, and he listened to the wind in the cottonwoods, and he thought about all of it, the leaving and the returning, the lie his mother had told him about a father who had died, and the truth he had ridden 400 miles to find, the old colt in his hands on a porch in New Mexico, and the way his father had knelt down in front of him without flinching. The long, quiet years afterward, in which forgiveness had never quite been spoken, but something almost like it had been built, slowly, a little at a time, the way a man builds a cabin with his own hands. He understood, standing there, that his mother had been right not to forgive Jonas, and that his father had been right not to ask for it. He understood that some wounds do not close, and that the people who carry them are not weak for carrying them, but strong, the way the mountains are strong, the way the high country is strong, the way a woman is strong who raises a child alone in a town that whispers behind her back and never once lets the whispers bend her shoulders. He understood that his mother had given him a gift greater than forgiveness. She had given him a life. She had given him a name. She had given him the steady, quiet love that had made him, in the end, into a man who could choose to stay. He knelt down at the edge of the creek. He put his hand into the cold, clean water, and he said, out loud, to no one and to everyone, the words he had never quite been able to say while his mother was alive. "Thank you, Mama. Thank you for staying." The wind moved through the cottonwoods. The water moved over the stones. And somewhere up on the hill behind the cabin, 3 graves lay quiet in the long red light of the evening. And the story of Eleanor Hayes, who had been left pregnant in the autumn of 1885, and who had never once let the leaving define her, came at last to its slow and peaceful end. She had not been forgotten. She had not been broken. She had loved her son with the whole long fierceness of her life, and her son had loved his son. And somewhere in the next valley, in the slow, steady rhythm of the country that had shaped them all, the small blue wildflowers would bloom again in the spring. And that, in the end, was enough.